So welcome everyone to Sangha Night. Hope you're having a lovely evening so far. So we're in our current theme that is called, nobody can remember what it's called, but I think it's called Light in the Darkness. Light in the Darkness, that's right. And we're looking at the Buddha's enlightenment, how he brought light into the world, and the earliest Buddhist teachings. And we're looking at how we can apply those really early, really fundamental teachings, how we can practice them in our modern world today, in our own society. So last week, Vimala Dasa looked at praticca samutpada, or conditioned co-arising, conditioned co-production, how everything in the world happens as a result of conditions, so how everything's conditioned. That was last week. And this week, we're going to take a look at a really important example of that, an example of conditionality. And we're going to be looking at the conditions that create conflict, the conditions that lead to conflict. So this teaching is taken from, it's called the Ball of Honey Sutta, or the Honey Ball Sutta. And sutta means it's a direct communication from the Buddha, so it's a direct discourse from the Buddha. And this evening's talk, it takes the form of a story. So our story involves an encounter between the Buddha and an old man called Dandapani. So Dandapani. Dandapani means stick in hand. So he's an old man and he has a stick in his hand. And he's described as having a furrowed brow and a wagging tongue. So we can sort of get the image of him, an impression of him that he's quite grumpy and he's quite opinionated. And the stick in his hand is so much his personality that it's become his name. That's his name, stick in hand. So he might be waving his stick about quite aggressively and he's sort of telling folks what's what with his stick. So this man, Dandapani, he comes across the Buddha and he asks the Buddha a question. So he asks the Buddha, what is this doctrine that you teach? And he's not asking for a teaching, so he's not receptive to the Buddha's wisdom. He's not asking in that way, he's asking as a challenge. And we come across this, sometimes people do this, so they've already made up their minds and they ask a question, but really they're looking for an argument. So we might have come across it, so what's all this Buddhism about, really? Not asking out of genuine interest, but really they've already made up their mind and they want a bit of a dispute. So Dandapani is doing that with the Buddha. So what is this doctrine that you teach? He's looking for an argument. And the Buddha answers him. And the Buddha says, I teach the sort of doctrine where one does not quarrel with anyone in the world. And Dandapani goes off, shaking his head, wagging his tongue, and raising his eyebrows so that his forehead was wrinkled into 3 furrows. So I don't think he was very pleased. I think he wanted a fight. Okay, so that's how our story starts. And it's the problem of argument and conflict. So, and it's just as relevant today, isn't it, obviously, in our society, as it was in the Buddha's day. So we have polarization around issues. It's really easy to read and hear strong views, to express strong views in politics, in the media, especially online. That's very easy to do nowadays. And we can become really entrenched in our own views and our own opinions, personal opinions. And we want to persuade other people that we're right. And we want to judge them as being wrong or as being bad. And before I go into the detail of the talk, I just want to add a really important kind of caveat here about not being in conflict and about being in harmony. That it doesn't mean just going along with anything and everything, no matter what. It doesn't mean just going along with stuff. We're not talking about enabling or ignoring unskillful action. That's not what we're saying. Because harmony can mean skillfully speaking up, saying no, having boundaries, taking skillful action wherever we have agency and influence, but doing it without engaging in conflict with another. So there's quite an art form. Okay, so back to our story. The Buddha's answer to Dandapani was that he teaches a doctrine about how not to quarrel. So what he says is, friend, I assert and proclaim my teaching. One who truly follows it does not quarrel anymore with anyone in the world. And he says that the culprit is a habit of mind called papancha, sometimes pronounced papancha. This is a really important term in Buddhism, papancha, and it kind of means thinking about, but it means thinking about in a very particular way. It has connotations of spreading out and complicating. It means mental proliferation, conceptual elaboration. It means that kind of complicating thinking. And we know how it works, we all do it. So we have a thought, and then we start going on a train of thought, one thing links to another. We're making all kinds of connections with the thinking, maybe involving memories, maybe bringing in ideas, maybe making predictions of the future. It's like it seems it's got a life of its own. And before we know it, we end up thinking about something completely seemingly random, and we don't even know how we got there. We don't know where that's come from. And it's this kind of going off, spreading out. That's papancha. And the Buddha says that papancha, mental proliferation, that leads to conflict. Okay, so in our story, a bit later on, the Buddha is with the monks, he's with his monks, and he tells the monks about his encounter with Dandapani and what was said. And he says to the monks that his teaching is the end of the obsessions of views, the obsessions of conceit, and the obsessions of ignorance. It is the end of taking up rods and bladed weapons, of arguments, quarrels, disputes, accusations, divisive tale-bearing, and false speech. And then he went to bed. And the monks were a bit confused. They were like, they didn't quite get it. They were like, okay, papancha creates conflict. How does the Buddha's teaching, how does this work? How does the Buddha's teaching stop all that? So they were quite intrigued, perplexed, a bit confused. So they then went and asked a very wise disciple called Kachana. And they asked him to explain what the Buddha meant. So Kachana said, well, why didn't you just ask the Buddha? Because, after all, he is the speaker, the proclaimer, the elucidator of meaning, the giver of the deathless, the Lord of the Dharma, the Tathagata. That was the time that you should have asked him about this matter. However he answered, that was how you should have remembered it. So the monk said, yeah, okay, we should have done that, but we didn't, and now he's gone to bed. So please, can you explain it to us? And then there's an amusing detail. They say, please explain it to us, but don't make it too difficult. So he gives them the teaching, and I must say, I've read the sutta, I think he did make it really difficult. He went into a lot of technical detail. Here's a diagram. There you go. So he explains that I'll talk through this, so don't look at this yet. So he explains the Nidana chain, like the chain of causality, conditionality that leads to conflict. He gives a really complex set of conditions and feedback loops involving the senses, the mind, and the world. He says things like, when there is a delineation of thinking, it is possible that one will delineate a delineation of being assailed by the perceptions and categories of objectification. So people have translated this sutta for us and simplified it. This is the simple diagram. This is the simplified version. And we can relate this to something that is familiar. We can relate this to the gap on the intro course. So remember the gap we have. So I'll talk through the process a little bit. But we can relate it to this familiar thing, the gap. So we have a stimulus or contact. So something happens and our senses have contact with something in the world. This is here, contact. And this gives rise to a feeling, what we call Vedana, a feeling. It's the initial basic direct feeling in the body, and it's pleasant or unpleasant. So it's pain or pleasure. Something happens, we experience pain or pleasure, and then we respond. So that's all here. That's our experience. And being in the gap, we learned, is about choosing a skillful response. So we have that, and we choose a response rather than just going with our feelings, rather than pushing away the painful and pulling towards us the pleasure. We can make a skillful choice based on ethics. Okay, so that's our starting point, and we are familiar with that. So this is the diagram of how this all works, or this conditionality. So we have this direct experience here. We have contact with something in the world. We have feeling, and this is our actual experience. So this is either pleasant or unpleasant, and we just have that. That just happens. That's fine. That's actually happening. We've got no choice really yet, and that's all fine. So we can call this bit here, this is primary reality. This is our direct experience. That happens, no choice, it's fine. And then we start to think, we start to do thinking. This is called vitarka. So this is thinking about our experience. And actually, again, this is fine. This is fine. There's no problem. There's nothing wrong with thinking. And I think this can sometimes be misunderstood in Buddhism, like we've just got to empty our minds and go blank or something. But vitarka, thinking, this is fine. The Buddha could think. The Buddha didn't walk into trees and wander off cliffs and things like that. He was a really powerful thinker, very effective thinker. We have to think. We've got to think. This is fine. So we think about our experience. That's vitarka. And then there's a few different ways this can go. So we can have what we call wise attention. So either this wise attention is staying with our primary experience. We think about what's actually going on. We stay aware of our feeling, we stay with it, and we're in the gap. That's all fine. That's this feedback. We're thinking and going back to our direct experience. That's great. We're in the gap. Or we can use wise thinking and go and apply the Dharma, apply the truth of the Dharma. So we can be thinking in terms of how things really are. So we're taking account of things like impermanence, interconnectedness, not being separate, not being personal, not all about me, the truth of dukkha, the precepts. This is wise thinking. And this type of thinking is realistic and it's kind and there's metta in it. So this is where it leads to spiritual progress and wisdom, and that's really great. So let's just do that all the time. Or maybe we might have a bit of unwise attention coming in, and this is where the problems come. So with unwise attention, if we do this, we're not thinking in line with how things really are. And other things start to get pulled into it. So we've got habitual tendencies in the mind. So we've got habitual ways of thinking. And we might think along the way that we might be doing blame and anger or craving, that kind of thinking. And it's just habit, it's habitual ways of thinking. And also getting pulled into this unwise attention is what we call received conditioning. So these are unexamined views. They're ideas and opinions that we just absorb from around us in our world and other people. So these are attitudes that we can pick up around group norms, society, culture, gender, politics, class. All these views, if they're not examined, just get pulled into this unwise thinking, and this is papancha. So that's what that is. So with unwise attention, what happens is we've gone into papancha, we've gone into this mental proliferation. It starts getting complicated, it starts spreading out, it's pulling in all this other stuff, and we're not staying with what's actually happening. Okay, so that's what we do. And the key point here really is that it's all done to try and deal with something that's either pleasant or unpleasant. It's all emotionally driven. And it's easy to not see that once we're in the realm of views and concepts and ideas, we think it's something else, but it's just come from feeling. This is what started it all. And the Buddha realized that it starts with the unpleasant or pleasant feeling back here. And our unwise thinking is just trying to deal with that. It's just trying to deal with not being able to handle the feeling. So that's how papancha comes about. So that's quite complex, but I'll just give us a simple example of how we go from simple, direct experience through thinking and into papancha. So an example, one that I've been doing a lot of this week, breaking down in my car. So say you break down in your car. You've got some contact, so you've got your car makes a noise and it stops going. That's the contact, that's here. And then you've got Vedana, or feeling, arises. You've probably got displeasure, discomfort, stress in the body. And again, up to here, that's all fine. It's just arising, there's no choice. And then we have to think about the situation, vitarka. So again, that's fine. We've got to think and decide and act. So we make the necessary phone calls, we take skillful action, we cancel the meeting we're supposed to be at, we get someone to come and pick up the kids, we call a breakdown company, we have to do that, and that's all fine. Then we've got some choice about what we do next. So we can stay with what's actually happening, direct experience, primary reality, being aware of our painful experience with self-metta and care and patience. And we can think wisely on how things really are and get some wisdom. We can go, well, everything's impermanent and unpredictable. Even my car, nothing's gone wrong as such. This is just arising out of conditions. So good, we might have that wise attention. We're aware of our feelings and we're thinking in line with reality. Or maybe we're not. So let's ramp it up a bit. What if it's getting dark, we've got no phone connectivity, we've got no breakdown cover, the kids are waiting, there's nobody there, the really important meeting's starting, and there's nothing we can do. We might be going into a tad of like unwise thinking, we might be catastrophizing and panicking, we might be blaming, and we might be getting really angry. So now we're not sat in the car, patiently aware of our unpleasant Vedana and blissfully immersed in the ever-changing flow of reality. No, we're not doing that. We've gone off into full-blown papancha and we're thinking, this car is rubbish. I want a better car. How can I possibly do my life with such a rubbish car? This is not fair. So-and-so should have sorted all this out. I told them last week it was going to break down. Always happens to me, just my luck. Total disaster. Okay, so that's papancha. And it's not helpful. It's really not helpful. Okay, so unwise attention leading to papancha. So how does, like the monks were saying, how does this then lead to conflict? Well, there's just the final part of this teaching here. And this is called papancha sama sankha. And that means something like thinking that puts things together. So far, something happens, we think unwisely about it, loads of stuff gets pulled in, we've basically gone off on one, and we're in papancha, we're doing this thinking, all this conceptual elaboration. So here we are in papancha, and what happens is we start to fix it. So it starts to solidify and it starts to get fixed. We start to come up with fixed ideas and fixed theories about things, fixed views, fixed opinions. And what we do is we fabricate a secondary reality, a completely different secondary reality. The world then is made up of our views and opinions about ourselves, other people, and the world, and we live in that world and we've created it, a secondary reality. And don't forget that all we've ever actually got is this: direct experience, primary reality. But now we've moved very far from that. So to go back to our broken down car example, we're not just sitting in a car anymore. We're living in a world of our personal views and opinions. And that world will be different for everybody, but it might be a world in which everything always goes wrong for me, or car mechanics never do what they're paid to do, or where it's really unfair because I work really hard and I still can't afford a decent car, or everybody's selfish and there's never any help with the kids. My manager is mean and just expects me to be there no matter what, or whatever. But we're very far from primary reality and a broken down car. So we've constructed this secondary reality. It's a private world of fixed views and opinions. And the problem is that we've all got different ones. We all create different worldviews, and our views then clash with other people's worldviews. So in the broken down car person's world, it's really unfair that they've got a rubbish car and a mean manager. And in the manager's world, their colleague is unreliable and they don't even bother to call when they miss a meeting. So this is how conflict arises, and it's just all coming from this. So our views clash, and that is how conflict arises. Okay, so that's the complicated diagram done. So back to our story. The monks heard this. They heard what wise Kachana said, and then they went back to the Buddha to check that they'd got it right. And the Buddha said, yep, that's right, you've got it. So they had now got the mechanism in the mind where they go from actual experience through primary reality, unwise attention, into papancha, and then into fixed views, into this secondary reality. And how, because we've all got different views, they can clash, and this is how conflict arises, so they've got it. So this teaching, it's really, really important because the Buddha has identified the internal conditions in the human mind by which we create misunderstanding, disagreement, and disharmony. Basically, the cause of all conflict, all hatred, and ultimately all war in the world. This is the mechanism. And the Buddha's explained it to us, and he said it's emotionally driven. It's just a misguided attempt to deal with uncomfortable feelings. That's all it is. So the monks were really, really pleased. Ananda said, it were as if one overcome with hunger, weakness, and thirst were to come across a ball of honey. Lord, what shall we call this sutta? And the Buddha said, call it the ball of honey sutta. Okay, so there we go. We've got the teaching. We've got the teaching of how conflict arises. So just to end really, to say that's quite theoretical and a little bit complicated. So how do we put this into practice? Is there anything we can do about this? Okay, so the key point is awareness, isn't it? Because usually, often, we don't notice what the mind is doing. We're living in our secondary reality. That's what we're doing. And we don't even know. We don't see it. And it's quite a hard practice. It's quite an advanced practice to bring awareness to all of this. But it ends all war and conflict in the world, so we can give it a bash. We can give it a try. Okay. So the first thing we can practice, just becoming more aware of our own personal views and opinions. So, can we hold our personal opinions lightly? Can we accept that they might not be ultimate? Maybe there's no right and wrong. Maybe there's just skillful and unskillful. Maybe everything really does arise out of conditions. And maybe compassion rather than judgment and criticism is the most appropriate response. Maybe our opinions are conditioned and maybe they are emotionally driven. Maybe we can try and look at that and hold our views lightly. So reflection, thinking, reflecting on things is really important here. Taking time to examine our own views in the light of the Dharma, actually doing that. So making time to reflect on what do we think, what do we believe? So maybe we can even put in our diary some reflection time. Oh, I'll have half an hour to think about something. Maybe we can do that. So that's the first thing, trying to hold our views lightly, examining our opinions. And secondly, can we become more aware of papancha when it's happening? And a clue to recognising papancha is it can have this flavour of sort of circular thinking, maybe quite obsessive thinking. We're going over and over the same thing again and again and not really getting anywhere. So when we've carefully thought about a situation and we've made a wise decision, can we just drop it? Can we just stop there? Or do we go over and over it? Maybe are we thinking about getting our own back, or making a prediction about how it's all going to work out, or worrying about the past, blaming other people, fantasizing about it being really differently, or arguing internally? And one way that this can show up is after we've had a conversation with someone, maybe a bit of a tricky, difficult conversation, we start going over it later on. Oh, I should have said that, or we should have said that, and then I should have said such and such, but then they would have just said so and so, and we're getting upset about what they would have said. And actually, it's just an imaginary conversation with somebody who isn't even there. And that's papancha, and I think we do that, we do that quite a lot. So all papancha is unskillful. It causes suffering, and it ultimately leads to conflict and pain. So can we practice not letting the mind put its energy into papancha? Maybe when we notice we're doing it, can we find some Dharma, a piece of Dharma or a practice that we can use instead to apply to the mind that can help? And the main thing really in trying to practice this is remembering to notice our thoughts. It's like really remember, it's mindfulness, bringing in awareness. So maybe we can set a reminder like on our phone or something, just at intervals during the day to just ask ourselves, what am I thinking? What am I actually thinking right now, and what do I believe? What am I doing with my mind? Is it wise? And it can be really hard. This can be a really difficult practice. But it's really freeing if we can make some progress with it. My experience of this is that I go into papancha when I'm in a really difficult situation, painful situation, when things are unpredictable and I've got no control. That's when this really happens for me. I just go into tons of papancha and anxious thinking and worrying over and over it. So some days my practice is to just try and notice the thoughts one by one as they come and put them in two piles. That's a wise thought. I can stay with that one. This is unwise. Put it down. Let it go. Sometimes, if it's really difficult, over and over again, all day, sometimes all day, it can be a practice for really dark times, really hard situations. And it's a very strong, effective practice for internal change and changing internal habits of mind. And also, a really simple practice we can do is mantra. Mantra protects the mind. Papancha is really sticky and it's really attractive. It's very convincing and it keeps pulling us back in. And a mantra changes the qualities of the mind directly. If we can recite a mantra either internally or out loud, it can really change this. It can stop papancha in its tracks. And the ultimate practice really is to keep bringing it back. And if we can notice our Vedana, really notice what is happening, what we're feeling in the body. It's really hard to do because the pace of life is quite fast and it's all kind of happening at once. It's more realistic to do this in meditation and on retreat. So if we can get on retreat, if we can meditate regularly, really try to look what is happening in the body, what is this Vedana, what is this feeling? So we're trying to notice this direct feeling in the body, coming out of the thinking mind and placing our awareness down directly into the body and just being interested and kind. Sometimes that's easier when it's really, really strong. So maybe we can try it when something's gone badly wrong, really, when something's really upsetting us, If somebody said something that's really upsetting us, maybe we can notice this strong reaction in the body. And instead of kind of just firing back with verbal daggers or whatever our particular tendency is, maybe avoiding or freezing, whatever we tend to do, maybe we can just feel the Vedana in the body, maybe just take a pause, and we can use the breath to help to stay with it. Okay, so that's a few ideas that what we can do. The key practice for all of this is kindness, because papancha can be very strong and very persuasive, and Vedana can be very painful and very strong. So it's really key to have self-compassion. What is the kindest thing to do when this is happening? Including for yourself, whatever is the kindest thing, that will be wise. So that's always a really key thing to remember. And far more important than all these personally created opinions, the most important thing is trying to act and think here in line with the precepts, in line with reality, how things really are, regardless of these arising feelings and these arising views. Because the most important thing the Buddha was saying, it's our shared humanity, to cultivate solidarity with other beings. And this is really important because this Honeyball Sutta, the Buddha has given us a way to do that. Thank you.